Elena Rodriguez stood on the train platform in the early morning light of September 15, 1943, clutching James Mitchell's hands as the locomotive's whistle announced a departure that would separate them for what they both hoped would be only a few months, but what both secretly feared might be forever. At 22 years old, Elena had never been separated from James for more than a few days since they had begun courting 3 years earlier, and the prospect of his deployment to the European theater felt like watching part of herself disappear into an uncertain and dangerous future. James was 24, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of earnest blue eyes and gentle manner that had first attracted Elena when they met at a church social in their small Indiana town in 1940. He worked at the local steel mill before his draft number was called, and he had proposed to Elena just 2 weeks before receiving his deployment orders, giving them barely enough time to plan an engagement, but not enough time for the wedding they both desperately wanted before his departure. "I'll write to you every day," James promised as the conductor's voice echoed across the platform, calling for final boarding. "And I'll be back before you know it. We'll have our wedding in the spring, just like we planned, and we'll buy that little house on Elm Street that you like so much." Elena nodded through her tears, trying to memorize every detail of James's face. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he smiled, the particular shade of blue in his eyes that reminded her of the sky on clear October afternoons. She had spent the previous 2 weeks trying to prepare herself for this moment, but nothing could have readied her for physical pain of watching the person she loved most disappear into a war that was claiming the lives of young men from their community with devastating regularity. "Take care of her for me, Michael," James said to a young man standing beside Elena on the platform, the childhood friend who had been like a brother to both of them since they were all in elementary school together. "Make sure she doesn't work too hard at the hospital, and remind her to eat regular meals. You know how she forgets to take care of herself when she's worried about other people." Michael Thornton nodded solemnly, accepting the responsibility that James was entrusting to him with the gravity that such a request deserved. At 23, Michael was the same age as James and had grown up in the same neighborhood, but a childhood bout with polio had left him with a slight limp in his left leg that had prevented him from passing the military physical examination. While James and most of their other friends had been drafted or had enlisted, Michael had remained in their hometown, working at the defense plant and carrying the complex emotions that came with being left behind while his friends went off to serve their country. Michael had been secretly in love with Elena since high school, but he had never acted on his feelings out of respect for friendship between Elena and James, and out of his own sense of honor and loyalty to his best friend. He had stood as James's best man at their engagement party, had helped James pick out Elena's engagement ring, and had supported their relationship even as it caused him private heartache to watch the woman he loved commit herself to another man. The train's departure was swift and final, leaving Elena and Michael standing together on the platform as the locomotive disappeared around the bend, carrying James toward an uncertain future in a war that had already transformed their small community and the lives of everyone they knew. Elena cried openly as they walked back to Michael's car, and Michael offered the kind of quiet comfort that had characterized their friendship for years, providing strength without asking for anything in return. Elena had been working as a nurse at the local military hospital since graduating from nursing school 18 months earlier, and her job had given her an intimate understanding of the costs that war was extracting from young men like James. She had cared for soldiers returning from the Pacific and European theaters with injuries that ranged from minor wounds to devastating trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. She had held the hands of dying boys who were barely older than herself, had written letters to families she would never meet, and had developed a kind of emotional resilience that comes from daily exposure to suffering and loss. But Elena's professional experience with wartime casualties had also made her acutely aware of the dangers that James would be facing, and her medical knowledge made it impossible for her to maintain the kind of optimistic denial that might have made his absence easier to bear. She knew too much about what happened to soldiers in combat, had seen too many young men who would never return home, and had witnessed too many families destroyed by telegrams from the War Department to believe that love and good intentions could protect James from the realities of war. Michael understood Elena's fears better than most people because he had been working at the defense plant where many of the hospital's patients had been employed before their military service, and he had maintained friendships with several young men who had returned from combat with injuries that had changed their lives forever. He had also developed his own complex relationship with the war, grateful to be contributing to the defense effort through his factory work, but also struggling with guilt about not being able to serve in combat alongside his friends, and carrying the burden of being one of the few healthy young men left in a community where most of his peers had gone off to fight. Elena's letters to James began arriving in England 3 weeks after his departure, and his responses started reaching her in Indiana about a month later. The correspondence became the central focus of Elena's emotional life, with each letter from James representing a confirmation that he was still alive and still thinking about their future together, while each day without mail brought anxiety about whether something had happened to him that she wouldn't learn about for weeks or months. James's early letters were filled with descriptions of his training, his fellow soldiers, and his hopes for a quick end to the war that would allow him to return home and marry Elena as they had planned. He wrote about the English countryside, the friendliness of the local people, and the camaraderie he had developed with the other men in his unit. His letters were optimistic and loving, filled with plans for their wedding and their life together after the war. If this story truly touches your heart, let it speak for you. Like this video, subscribe to be part of our journey, and share your feelings in the comments. Elena treasured each letter, reading and rereading them until the paper was worn soft from handling, and she responded with detailed account of her work at the hospital, news from their hometown, and expressions of love and longing that helped her feel connected to James despite the thousands of miles that separated them. Writing to James became a daily ritual that provided structure and meaning to her life during a period when the future felt uncertain and frightening. Michael had become Elena's primary source of companionship and emotional support during the months following James's departure. He would drive her home from her nursing shifts at the hospital, often staying for dinner with Elena and her mother, and he would escort her to community events and church services where the absence of so many young men had created an unusual social dynamic that made unaccompanied young women more noticeable and sometimes uncomfortable. Elena appreciated Michael's friendship during this difficult period, but she was also increasingly aware of the way his presence in her life was filling some of the emotional void left by James's absence. Michael was intelligent and thoughtful, with a quiet sense of humor, and a deep understanding of Elena's personality and interests that came from years of friendship. He was also physically present in ways that James could not be, available to provide comfort and companionship during the difficult moments that came with wartime uncertainty and the demanding emotional work of caring for wounded soldiers. The first indication that something might be developing between Elena and Michael came in December 1943, during a Christmas celebration at the hospital where Elena worked. The staff had organized a party for the patients who were too injured to go home for the holidays, and Michael had volunteered to help with the decorations and entertainment. Elena watched Michael interacting with the wounded soldiers, joking with them, listening to their stories, and providing the kind of masculine companionship that many of them were missing, and she felt a warmth and affection for him that seemed to go beyond their established friendship. After the party, Michael walked Elena home through the snow-covered streets of their small town, and their conversation was more intimate and personal than it had ever been before. Michael spoke about his feelings of guilt and inadequacy about not being able to serve in the military, and Elena shared her fears about James's safety and her struggle to maintain hope during the long months of uncertainty. The conversation created a sense of emotional connection between them that felt both comforting and dangerous, given Elena's commitment to James and Michael's loyalty to his best friend. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life," Elena confided to Michael as they walked slowly through the quiet neighborhood where they had all grown up together. "I'm going through all the motions of waiting for James to come home, but there are moments when I can barely remember what it felt like to be with him. Is it terrible that sometimes I feel more real when I'm talking to you than when I'm reading his letters?" Michael's response was careful and thoughtful, reflecting the moral complexity of their situation and his own conflicted feelings about Elena and James. "I think what you're feeling is normal," he said. "James is fighting a war thousands of miles away, and you're living your life here with all the daily challenges and experiences that he can't share. It makes sense that you would feel more connected to the people who are actually present in your life right now." The conversation marked a turning point in Elena and Michael's relationship, creating an acknowledgement of the emotional connection that was developing between them while also establishing the boundaries that their loyalty to James required them to maintain. Both Elena and Michael understood that they were entering dangerous territory, but neither was willing to completely withdraw from the friendship and support that had become essential to both of their emotional well-being during the difficult wartime period. Elena's letters to James during the winter months of 1943 and 1944 began to reflect the changes in her daily life and emotional state, though she was careful not to mention the increasing importance of Michael's presence in her routine. She wrote about her work at the hospital, community events, and news from their hometown, but she found herself editing her accounts to avoid mentioning how much time she was spending with Michael or how much she had come to depend on his companionship and support. James's letters during the same period began to reflect the increasing stress and danger of his military service as his unit prepared for and then participated in the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. His correspondence became less frequent and more focused on immediate survival concerns rather than future planning. The optimistic tone of his early letters was replaced by a grimmer realism about the length and difficulty of the war, and his expressions of love for Elena became more desperate and intense, as if he was trying to hold on to their relationship as an anchor in the chaos and horror of combat. The change in James's letters created additional emotional strain for Elena, who could sense the psychological toll that combat was taking on a man she loved while feeling helpless to provide the kind of support and comfort that he needed. Her medical training made her aware of the symptoms of combat stress and trauma that were becoming apparent in James's correspondence, but her physical separation from him made it impossible for her to provide the kind of care and healing that her nursing experience had taught her was essential for recovery. Michael became increasingly important to Elena during this period, not just as a companion and friend, but as someone who could provide the kind of emotional intimacy and physical comfort that Elena was missing in her relationship with James. Michael's presence in her daily life became a source of stability and normalcy that helped her cope with the uncertainty and stress of having a loved one in combat, but also created a competing source of emotional attachment that began to challenge Elena's commitment to James. The transformation of Elena and Michael's relationship from friendship to something approaching love was gradual and largely unspoken, marked by small gestures and moments of connection that accumulated over months of shared experience. Michael would bring Elena flowers from his mother's garden, would remember details about her preferences and interests that even James had sometimes overlooked, and would provide the kind of attentive companionship that made Elena feel valued and understood in ways that had been missing from her life since James's departure. Elena found herself looking forward to her time with Michael in ways that felt both natural and troubling, given her commitment to James and her understanding of the moral implications of developing romantic feelings for another man while her fiancé was risking his life in combat. She tried to maintain appropriate boundaries in her relationship with Michael, but she also found herself increasingly reluctant to limit their time together or to discourage the emotional intimacy that was developing between them. The crisis that would ultimately force Elena to confront her divided loyalties came in August 1944, when James's letters suddenly stopped arriving. For 3 weeks, Elena received no communication from James, despite the fact that his previous letters had been arriving regularly every 5 to 7 days. The silence created intense anxiety for Elena, who began checking the mail obsessively and monitoring news reports about casualties in James's division. Michael tried to provide comfort and reassurance during this difficult period, suggesting that mail delays were common during active combat operations and that the absence of letters didn't necessarily indicate that James had been killed or wounded. But Elena's medical experience had made her familiar with the notification procedures used by the military, and she knew that families were typically informed of casualties much more quickly than personal mail was delivered. So the absence of both letters and official notification created a particularly anxiety-provoking form of uncertainty. The emotional stress of not knowing James's fate, combined with the intensity of her daily work caring for wounded soldiers and the complicated feelings she had developed for Michael, pushed Elena to a psychological breaking point that resulted in the first physical expression of the romantic feelings that had been developing between her and Michael for months. The moment occurred on a Friday evening in late August, when Elena had received another day of empty mailbox and had spent her shift at the hospital caring for a young soldier who had been brought in with injuries similar to what she imagined James might be suffering somewhere in France. Michael found Elena crying in her car in the hospital parking lot after his shift, overwhelmed by the combination of professional stress and personal anxiety that had been building for weeks. Michael's attempt to comfort Elena led to their first kiss, a moment of physical and emotional connection that represented the culmination of months of growing attraction and the crossing of a boundary that both of them had been trying to maintain out of loyalty to James. The kiss was both a source of comfort for Elena and a moment of moral crisis that forced both Elena and Michael to confront the reality of their feelings for each other and the implications of those feelings for their relationship with James. "This can't happen again," Elena said after the kiss, though even as she spoke the words, she knew that the emotional connection between her and Michael had progressed beyond the point where it could be easily contained or denied. "James is counting on both of us to be here for him when he comes home, and we can't betray his trust by developing feelings for each other." Michael agreed with Elena's assessment of their moral obligations to James, but he also expressed the feelings that had been building in for months and that had been intensified by the uncertainty about James's fate. "I've been in love with you since high school," Michael admitted, "but I never said anything because I knew you belonged with James, and I would never do anything to hurt him. But now, with not knowing whether he's alive or dead, and with you needing support that I can provide and he can't, I don't know how to be what you need without crossing lines that we promised not to cross." The conversation that followed was one of the most emotionally difficult of Elena's life, as she was forced to acknowledge her own feeling for Michael while also grappling with the guilt and confusion of developing romantic attachment to another man while her fiancé was missing in action. She realized that her feelings for Michael had grown beyond friendship and gratitude into something that could legitimately be called love, but she also understood that acting on those feelings while James's fate was unknown would represent betrayal that she might never be able to forgive herself for. Elena and Michael agreed to limit their contact while they waited for news about James, hoping that some physical and emotional distance would allow them to regain perspective and recommit to their obligations to their friend. But the separation was painful for both of them, and it came at a time when Elena most needed the support and comfort that Michael had been providing during the months of uncertainty about James's safety. 2 weeks later, Elena received a letter from James that had been delayed by military postal system complications and combat operations that had prevented regular mail delivery. The letter confirmed that James was alive and physically uninjured, but it also revealed that he had been through some of the most intense combat of the war and was struggling with psychological trauma that he was unable to articulate clearly in his correspondence. James's letter was both a relief and a source of additional moral complexity for Elena, who was grateful to learn that he was alive, but also forced to confront the fact that her feelings for Michael had not diminished during their separation, and that learning of James's survival had not automatically restored her exclusive emotional commitment to their relationship. Instead, Elena found herself torn between relief about James's safety and disappointment that his survival meant she would have to choose between him and Michael rather than having that choice made for her by circumstances beyond her control. The letter also revealed changes in James that made Elena question whether the man who eventually returned from the war would be the same person she had fallen in love with and agreed to marry. His writing style had become more fragmented and intense. His references to future plans were more vague and uncertain, and his expressions of love for Elena seemed to carry a desperation that suggested he was clinging to their relationship as a source of psychological stability rather than celebrating it as a source of joy and connection. Elena's response to James's letter was carefully crafted to express her relief about his safety and her continued commitment to their relationship. But she found herself struggling to write with the same spontaneous affection and enthusiasm that had characterized her earlier correspondence. Her feelings for Michael had created an emotional distance from James that she couldn't completely bridge through letter writing, and she was increasingly aware that her development as a person during the months of separation had taken her in directions that James couldn't share or understand from his position thousands of miles away. Michael's reaction to the news of James's survival was complex and painful, combining genuine relief about his friend's safety with personal disappointment about the implications for his relationship with Elena. Michael had been hoping, despite his guilt about such feelings, that James's death would free Elena to pursue their relationship without the moral complications of betraying a friend. But James's survival meant that Michael would have to choose between his friendship with James and his love for Elena. The three-way correspondence that developed over the following months created an increasingly unsustainable emotional situation for all three young people. James continued writing to Elena about their future together, making plans for their wedding and their life after the war, while also writing to Michael about his combat experiences and his gratitude for Michael's friendship and support of Elena during his absence. Elena continued writing to James with expressions of love and commitment that became increasingly difficult for her to generate authentically, while also maintaining a careful friendship with Michael that both of them knew was founded on romantic feelings that they were trying to suppress. Michael attempted to maintain his friendships with both Elena and James while dealing with his own emotional turmoil about loving his best friend's fiancé and being unable to act on those feelings without betraying someone he cared about deeply. The situation became more complex in the spring of 1945 as the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, and it became apparent that James would be returning home within a matter of months rather than years. Elena realized that she would soon be forced to make a definitive choice between James and Michael, and that the decision she made would have permanent consequences for all three of their lives. Elena's internal struggle intensified as she tried to evaluate her feelings for both men and understand what her moral obligations required her to do. She loved James and felt committed to the relationship and future they had planned together, but she was also aware that her feelings for him had changed during their separation, and that the person she had become during the war might not be compatible with the person James had been before his military service or the person he would be when he returned. Elena was deeply in love with Michael and had found in him a kind of emotional and intellectual compatibility that she had never experienced with James. But she was also aware that a relationship with Michael would be founded on betrayal of James's trust and the abandonment of commitments she had made during a period when James was risking his life in service to their country. The moral complexity of Elena's situation was intensified by her work at the military hospital, where she had observed the psychological and physical toll that combat had taken on young men like James, and where she had developed a deep appreciation for the sacrifices that soldiers made and the loyalty they deserved from the people they loved. Elena's professional experience had taught her that combat veterans needed stability and support during their readjustment to civilian life, and she understood that James would be particularly vulnerable during the period immediately following his return from the war. But Elena had also learned from her nursing experience that authenticity and honesty in relationships were essential for genuine healing and growth, and she was increasingly convinced that entering a marriage with James while harboring deep feelings for Michael would be unfair to everyone involved and would likely result in unhappiness for all three of them. Elena's decision-making process was influenced by a conversation she had with Dr. Margaret Harrison, the chief nurse at the military hospital where Elena worked. Dr. Harrison was a woman in her 40s who had never married, having dedicated her life to her medical career during a period when marriage and professional achievement were often mutually exclusive for women. Dr. Harrison had observed Elena's emotional struggle over the previous months, and she provided guidance based on her own experience with difficult choices and her professional understanding of human psychology and relationships. The question you need to ask yourself, Dr. Harrison told Elena during a quiet moment at the hospital, is not which choice will make you happiest in the short term, or even which choice is most fair to the men involved. The question is which choice will allow you to live with integrity and authenticity for the rest of your life, and which choice will create the conditions for the kind of deep, honest relationships that sustain people through the difficulties that life inevitably brings. Dr. Harrison's advice helped Elena understand that her decision about James and Michael was not just about romantic love or personal happiness, but about the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of life she wanted to live. Elena realized that she had changed significantly during the war years, developing a sense of independence, professional competence, and emotional depth that might not be compatible with the traditional marriage that she and James had planned before his deployment. Elena also understood that Michael knew and appreciated the person she had become during the war in ways that James, who had been absent during her period of greatest growth and change, might not be able to understand or accept. Her relationship with Michael was based on shared experience and mutual understanding of who they were as mature adults, while her relationship with James was founded on memories and plans that had been created before either of them had been tested by the challenges and responsibilities of wartime life. The decision that Elena ultimately made was influenced by a letter she received from James in April 1945, shortly before the end of the war in Europe. James's letter described his experiences during the final months of combat and his psychological state as he prepared to return home, and it revealed aspects of his personality and worldview that had been changed by his military service in ways that Elena found difficult to accept or understand. James had become more rigid and authoritarian in his thinking, more traditional in his expectations about gender roles and family relationships, and more bitter about the sacrifices he had made during his military service. His letter expressed expectations about Elena's behavior and their future relationship that suggested, He wanted to return to the kind of traditional marriage that had been common before the war, with Elena leaving her nursing career to focus on domestic responsibilities and child-rearing. The letter also revealed that James had developed a sense of entitlement about Elena's loyalty and commitment that made Elena uncomfortable, as if he believed that his military service had earned him the right to expect certain things from her regardless of how her own feelings and priorities had evolved during their separation. James's tone suggested that he viewed Elena's fidelity during his absence as a debt that she owed him rather than as a gift that she had chosen to give. Elena's response to James's letter marked the beginning of her decision to end their engagement and pursue a relationship with Michael. She wrote to James explaining that she had changed during their separation in ways that made their original plan for marriage incompatible with the person she had become, and that she believed both of them deserved relationships based on mutual understanding and shared values rather than obligation and pre-war commitments. Elena's letter to James was one of the most difficult pieces of writing she had ever attempted, as she tried to be honest about her feelings and decisions while also expressing gratitude for his military service and respect for the sacrifices he had made. She explained that she had developed feelings for Michael during James's absence, but she emphasized that her decision to end their engagement was based primarily on her recognition that they had grown in different directions during the war, and that a marriage between them would likely result in unhappiness for both of them. James's response to Elena's letter was immediate and devastating, expressing betrayal, anger, and disbelief that Elena would abandon their relationship while he was still serving overseas and had not yet had the opportunity to return home and discuss their future in person. James accused Elena of disloyalty and selfishness, and he blamed Michael for taking advantage of his absence to steal Elena's affections while James was risking his life in combat. James also wrote to Michael, ending their friendship and accusing him of betraying their bond by pursuing Elena during his absence. James's letter to Michael was filled with anger and hurt, describing their relationship as a betrayal that had violated the trust and loyalty that should exist between friends, especially during wartime when such loyalty was particularly important. Michael's response to James's letter was an attempt to explain the development of his feeling for Elena and to express his own struggle with the moral complexity of the situation. But James was unwilling to consider any justification for what he saw as a fundamental betrayal by his two closest friends. The friendship between James and Michael, which had lasted for over 15 years, was permanently destroyed by the romantic triangle that had developed during James's military service. The aftermath of Elena's decision to choose Michael over James created lasting consequences for all three of their lives that extended far beyond the immediate emotional pain of the breakup and the end of the friendship. Elena and Michael married in June 1945, just 1 month after the end of the war in Europe, in a small ceremony that was marked by the absence of many friends and family members who felt that Elena's treatment of James had been morally wrong. James returned from his military service to find that the life he had been planning and the relationships he had been counting on no longer existed, and he struggled with the dual trauma of combat experience and personal betrayal during his readjustment to civilian life. James never married, and he carried bitterness about Elena and Michael's betrayal for the rest of his life, viewing their relationship as a symbol of the ways that the people he had trusted and fought to protect had failed to honor the sacrifices he had made for them. Elena and Michael's marriage was initially happy, based on the deep emotional connection and mutual understanding that had developed between them during the war years. They had 3 children together and built successful careers. Elena continued working as a nurse, and Michael eventually started his own business. But their relationship was always marked by the knowledge that it had been founded on the betrayal of James's trust and the abandonment of Elena's original commitments. The guilt and moral complexity of their situation affected Elena and Michael's relationship in ways that became more apparent as the years passed. Elena struggled with depression during several periods of their marriage, particularly around the anniversaries of James's departure and their decision to end their engagement. Michael battled with feelings of inadequacy and guilt about his role in the destruction of his friendship with James, and he never fully recovered from the loss of that relationship. Both Elena and Michael were also affected by the knowledge that their happiness had been built on James's pain, and that their love story was also a story of betrayal and abandonment that had caused lasting harm to someone they both cared about deeply. The awareness that James had never recovered from their betrayal and had lived his entire life as a single, bitter man created a shadow over Elena and Michael's marriage that never completely disappeared. 10 years after the end of the war, Elena encountered James by chance at a community event, and the meeting forced her to confront the long-term consequences of the decision she had made. James was polite but distant, and Elena could see in his eyes the lasting pain that her choice had caused him. The encounter made Elena realize that while she had found happiness with Michael, that happiness had come at a cost that she had not fully understood when she made her decision. Elena's conversation with James was brief and superficial, but provided her with insight into the man he had become and the ways that the war and her betrayal had shaped his subsequent life. James had become a successful businessman, but had never developed the kinds of close personal relationships that might have provided him with happiness and fulfillment. He had remained single, had never had children, and had lived a life marked by emotional isolation and mistrust of others. The meeting with James forced Elena to evaluate her marriage to Michael and to consider whether the happiness they had found together justified the pain they had caused James and the betrayal of the commitments she had made during wartime. Elena realized that moral choices often involve trade-offs and compromises that could not be easily evaluated in terms of right and wrong, and that the decision to choose authentic love over loyal commitment had created both benefits and costs that would affect all three of their lives permanently. Michael's reaction to Elena's encounter with James was complex. Combining guilt about the pain their relationship had caused their friend with defensive feelings about the legitimacy of their love and marriage. Michael had spent 15 years trying to convince himself that their relationship was morally justified by the depth of their feelings for each other and the happiness they had found together. But seeing James forced Michael to confront the reality of the harm their choices had caused. The encounter with James also prompted Elena and Michael to discuss their relationship and its foundation more honestly than they had in years, leading to a deeper understanding of the ways that guilt and moral complexity had affected their marriage and their individual psychological well-being. They realized that they had both been carrying unresolved feelings about their treatment of James, and that these feelings had influenced their relationship in ways that had prevented them from experiencing the complete happiness and peace that might have been possible if their love had developed under different circumstances. Elena and Michael's marriage ultimately lasted 43 years, ending only with Michael's death from heart disease in 1988. Their relationship had been marked by genuine love and compatibility, but also by the ongoing awareness that their happiness had been built on foundations that involved moral compromise and the betrayal of trust. They had created a successful family and had contributed positively to their community, but they had also lived with the knowledge that their choices during the war had caused lasting harm to someone they had both loved and respected. James died alone in 1995, having never married or developed the kinds of close personal relationships that might have provided him with the emotional support and companionship that most people need for psychological well-being. His death was marked by a small funeral attended primarily by business associates and distant relatives, a final testament to the isolation that had characterized his life since his return from the war and the betrayal by his fiancé and best friend. Elena lived until 2003, long enough to reflect extensively on the choices she had made during the war and their long-term consequences for all three of the lives involved. In her final years, Elena often spoke about the moral complexity of wartime decisions and the ways that extraordinary circumstances could force people to make choices that had permanent consequences for themselves and others. Elena's reflections on her wartime love triangle emphasized the difference between making the right choice and making the choice that leads to personal happiness. And she acknowledged that her decision to choose Michael over James had been based primarily on her own feelings and needs rather than on moral principles or consideration of the harm that her choice might cause others. "I loved Michael more than I loved James," Elena told her daughter during one of their final conversations, "and I believe that choosing to marry the person I loved most deeply was the right thing to do. But I also caused James a lifetime of pain, and I broke promises that I had made during a time when those promises were particularly important. I don't know if there was a right choice in that situation, but I know that every choice had consequences that affected all of our lives forever." Elena's daughter, who had grown up knowing about the complicated origins of her parents' marriage, asked whether Elena regretted her decision to choose Michael over James. Elena's response reflected the moral complexity that had characterized her thinking about the situation for over 50 years. "I regret the pain that our choice caused James," Elena said, "and I regret that I broke promises I had made when those promises were sacred. But I don't regret marrying your father, because our love was real and deep, and it created you and your brothers and a life that brought joy to many people. I learned that sometimes there are no perfect choices, only choices that we have to live with and try to make meaningful through how we use the rest of our lives. Elena's final perspective on her wartime love triangle reflected a mature understanding of moral complexity that had taken decades to develop. She had come to believe that the circumstances of war had created impossible situations that forced people to make choices between competing loyalties and values, and that judging those choices required understanding the context in which they were made as well as their long-term consequences. Elena's story became part of her family's oral history, passed down through her children and grandchildren as an example of the ways that war could complicate human relationships and force people to confront fundamental questions about love, loyalty, and moral obligation. Her experience had taught her family that moral decisions often involve trade-offs and compromises that could not be easily evaluated in terms of absolute right and wrong, and that the most important measure of such decisions was not their immediate consequences, but the ways that people chose to live with those consequences over time. The story of Elena, James, and Michael also became part of the broader historical narrative about the impact of World War II on American families and communities, illustrating the ways that military service and wartime separation could transform personal relationships and create lasting consequences that extended far beyond the end of the conflict itself. Military historians and sociologists who studied the social impact of World War II often cited cases like Elena's as examples of the complex ways that war affected not just the soldiers who fought in combat, but also the families and communities that supported them from home. The separation of couples by military service, the changing roles of women during wartime, and the psychological challenges of reunion after extended separation had created social dynamics that influenced American family life for generations. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociologist who studied wartime relationships and their long-term effects, included Elena's story in a book about the social history of World War II that was published in the 1990s. Dr. Williams interviewed Elena extensively during the final years of her life, using her story as an example of the moral complexity that wartime circumstances could create for people who were trying to maintain relationships across vast distances and uncertain time frames. Elena's situation was not unusual during World War II. Dr. Williams wrote in her analysis of wartime relationships, "Thousands of young women face similar choices between loyalty to absent fiancés and husbands and attachment to the men who remained available to provide support and companionship during the long years of wartime separation. What makes Elena's story particularly valuable is her willingness to reflect honestly on the moral dimensions of her choice and its long-term consequences for everyone involved." Dr. Williams' research revealed that Elena's experience was part of a broader pattern of relationship changes that occurred during World War II, as military service created extended separations that tested the strength of romantic commitments and created opportunities for new relationships to develop. Many marriages and engagements that had been formed before the war did not survive the challenges of wartime separation, while other relationships were strengthened by the experience of surviving difficult circumstances together. The sociological analysis of Elena's case emphasized the ways that war created extraordinary circumstances that made ordinary moral frameworks inadequate for evaluating human behavior and relationships. Dr. Williams argued that Elena's choice between James and Michael could not be understood simply as a matter of personal preference or moral failing, but had to be evaluated in the context of the social and psychological pressures that wartime circumstances created for everyone involved. "The tragedy of Elena's situation," Dr. Williams wrote, "was not that she made the wrong choice, but that the war created circumstances in which any choice she made would cause significant pain to people she cared about." Her story illustrates the ways that war forces individuals to make decisions that have permanent consequences for themselves and others, often without adequate information about the likely outcomes of those decisions. Elena's grandchildren, who grew up hearing her story as part of their family history, developed their own perspectives on the moral dimensions of her wartime choices. Some viewed Elena's decision as an understandable response to extraordinary circumstances, while others questioned whether her treatment of James had been fair or ethical given his military service and the sacrifices he had made. Elena's granddaughter, Sarah, who became a therapist specializing in relationship counseling, often used her grandmother's story as an example of the ways that moral decisions could have long-term consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances in which they were made. "My grandmother's story taught me that love and loyalty can sometimes come into conflict with each other," Sarah explained during a professional conference about family therapy. She had to choose between being loyal to promises she had made and being honest about feelings that had developed over time. There was no choice that would have avoided causing pain to someone she cared about, but there were choices that would have caused different types of pain to different people. Sarah's analysis of her grandmother's situation emphasized the importance of considering long-term consequences when making decisions about relationships and moral obligations. She argued that Elena's choice to pursue authentic love rather than maintain loyal commitment had created both benefits and costs that had affected multiple generations of their family. Elena and Michael had a good marriage and raised successful children who contributed positively to their community, Sarah observed. But their happiness was always shadowed by the knowledge that it had been built on James's pain. Their children grew up understanding that moral decisions often involve trade-offs and compromises, and that the most important measure of such decisions was how people chose to live with the consequences of their choices. The broader historical context of Elena's story also provided insight into the ways that World War II had challenged traditional expectations about gender roles, family relationships, and social responsibilities. Elena's work as a nurse had given her a sense of professional identity and personal independence that might not have been available to women of her generation under peacetime circumstances, and this transformation had influenced her ability to make autonomous decisions about her personal relationships. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a historian who studied the impact of World War II on American women, argued that Elena's story illustrated the ways that wartime circumstances had created opportunities for women to develop new identities and capabilities that sometimes came into conflict with traditional expectations about female loyalty and self-sacrifice. Elena's nursing experience had taught her to make life-and-death decisions independently and to trust her own judgment about complex moral situations, Dr. Thompson wrote in her analysis of women's wartime experiences. This professional training and experience may have influenced her willingness to make autonomous decisions about her personal relationships, even when those decisions conflicted with traditional expectations about female loyalty and commitment. The historical analysis of Elena's case also revealed the ways that World War II had created social conditions that made traditional moral frameworks inadequate for evaluating human behavior. The extended separations caused by military service, the psychological trauma of combat, and the changing roles of women in society had created new types of moral dilemmas that required new approaches to understanding ethical behavior and personal responsibility. Elena's story ultimately became part of the larger narrative about the ways that World War II had transformed American society and created lasting changes in family relationships, gender roles, and moral expectations. Her experience illustrated both the costs and benefits of social change, showing how extraordinary circumstances could create opportunities for personal growth and authentic relationships, while also causing pain and disruption for individuals and families. The woman who had loved two men during the war had learned that moral decisions often required choosing between competing values and loyalties, and that the most important measure of such choices was not their immediate consequences, but the ways that people chose to live with those consequences over time. Elena's story became a testament to the complexity of human relationships and the difficulty of making moral decisions in circumstances where any choice would cause significant consequences for multiple people. Elena's legacy lived on not just in the family she created with Michael, but in the broader understanding she had contributed to the historical record about the human cost of war and the moral complexity that extraordinary circumstances could create for ordinary people. Her story served as a reminder that love, loyalty, and moral obligation could sometimes come into conflict with each other, and that the most important human quality was not the ability to make perfect decisions, but the willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of the decisions one made and to use those experiences to live with greater wisdom and compassion. The tale of Elena Rodriguez, James Mitchell, and Michael Thornton became a chapter in the larger story of how World War II had tested the moral frameworks and relationship structures that had defined American society before the war, and how individuals and families had adapted to new circumstances that required new approaches to love, loyalty, and personal responsibility. Their story illustrated both the resilience of the human heart and the lasting consequences that moral choices could have for multiple generations, showing that the most profound human experiences often involve navigating the tension between competing loyalties and the challenge of living authentically while also accepting responsibility for the ways that personal decisions affected others. In the end, Elena's story was not simply about choosing between two men, but about the broader challenge of maintaining moral integrity while adapting to extraordinary circumstances that challenge traditional frameworks for understanding right and wrong. Her experience demonstrated that the most important human capacity was not the ability to avoid difficult choices, but a willingness to make those choices with full awareness of their consequences and to live with the results in ways that honor both the complexity of human relationships and the responsibility that each person bears for the effects of their decisions on others. The woman who had been divided between the soldier who left and a friend who stayed had ultimately learned that love and loyalty were not always compatible, and that the most authentic human relationships sometimes require the courage to choose difficult truths over comfortable obligations. Her story became a testament to the complexity of the human heart and the ways that extraordinary circumstances could reveal both the best and worst aspect of human nature, creating opportunities for profound connection and authentic love, while also causing pain and loss that could last for generations. If you made it all the way here, it means this story truly held you. So don't leave without showing some love. Hit like, subscribe to stay with us, and drop a comment. I'll be here, reading every word you share.